Today in Russia, they admitted that their economy is in a nosedive and it won't be possible to save it anytime soon. The Central Bank of the Russian Federation has started the printing press for 15 trillion rubles to continue the war, which will ultimately lead to financial collapse. And even the Russians themselves are already admitting this. As it became known, back on July 7, 2025, the head of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, signed a secret order instructing Gosnak to print 15 trillion rubles by October. Moreover, as they stated in Russia, the situation with bad debts in the Russian banking sector is worse than what is shown by the official statistics. And this even forced the heads of the largest banks to turn to the government for help. But the Kremlin can't even help itself, so it tells them to deal with these bad debts on their own. Bad debts are when Russians have taken out loans and absolutely can't pay them back. That's why the Kremlin has called for simply increasing taxes on Russians in order to be able to continue the war. Moreover, the Russian Finance Minister Anton Siluanov has officially admitted that the Kremlin is mobilizing its last income reserves and is ready to sacrifice all spending except for priority ones. And as Siluanov stated, now money will primarily be spent on the war and not, for example, on social support for citizens. Moreover, the Federation Council has called to simply abandon all infrastructure projects in order not to spend money on building bridges, roads, hospitals, schools, and so on. They say priorities have changed due to the war. I'm Alexei Pecci, and today is July 17th. Let's discuss this topic. Before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pecci News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So, the news that became known thanks to Ukrainian hackers hacking into the correspondence of officials from the Central Bank of the Russian Federation. As it became known from the documents of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation, Nabiullina gave the order to print 15 trillion rubles, officially for stabilizing inflation and financing priority expenses. In reality, it's for the war, mobilization, and creating the illusion of social stability. But starting up the printing press always leads to disaster, especially on this scale. And this scale is historic. In the next 3 months, the amount of cash in the Russian Federation will double. And, as experts say, this didn't even happen in 1998 when there was a huge crisis, or in 2022. With an emission of 3 trillion rubles, inflation almost doubled. And now they will print 5 times more money. Therefore, according to economists' forecasts, by winter, Russia will face an inflationary shock. This means a collapse of the ruble, rising prices, shortages, capital flight, grey schemes, and of course, mass impoverishment of Russians. This is a direct path to financial collapse, and the central bank foresees it but hides it from the public. Although Nabiullina herself has already tried to somehow signal to Russians that the economy is in complete trouble. In addition, in an attempt to balance next year's budget, the authorities of the Russian Federation are mobilizing the last reserves of income and are ready to sacrifice all expenditures except for the priority ones. This is the official statement from Anton Siluanov, Russia's Minister of Finance. Today, he publicly stated that the situation with revenues is tense, so quote, all available resources must be used and everything unnecessary must be abandoned. For example, what do you think is considered unnecessary in the understanding of the Minister of Finance of the Russian Federation? He suggests abandoning infrastructure projects across Russia for at least a couple of years. He says building infrastructure like bridges, roads, hospitals, and schools should be postponed until the time is right. Moreover, he says we need to give up on some developments, technologies, any kind of progress. He says there's no need to spend money on all that, let's gather it all and direct it toward the war. And as a lifeline for the economy, Siluanov himself suggested simply privatizing whatever hasn't been sold off yet in Russia. He says we have too many state-owned enterprises, so let's just sell them. Just sell them, make some money from it, spend it on the war, and what happens tomorrow doesn't matter at all. Moreover, according to Siluanov, it's perfectly fine to sell Russian enterprises. Who do you think will buy them? The Chinese. They're ready to purchase and the Kremlin will get funds for the war? Well, this kind of economic expansion by China is ongoing. And as Siluanov admitted officially in the first half of the year, the deficit in the Russian budget amounted to 3.7 trillion rubles. Although for the entire year of 2025, they recently planned this deficit to be 3.8 trillion rubles. They've already reached that amount in the first half of the year. However, that's not everything. Officially, at the beginning of this year, the government of the Russian Federation planned for a deficit of 1.2 trillion rubles for the entire year. 1.2 and 3.7, you can feel the difference. And that's what they announced officially. Well, the real numbers are even worse. The main reason for the decline in Russia's budget revenues, according to Silvanov himself, is the drop in income from selling Russian oil. And now, the most interesting part, oil and gas revenues account for 78% of the Russian budget's income. And Silvanov is panicking because of this. He says, we're making much less money from selling oil now, and just imagine, 78% of our budget comes from oil and gas revenues. But of course, in Russia, they found a way out of this situation. The Federation Council stated that the Russian authorities need to look for additional sources of income for the treasury, which has been hit by reduced oil and gas revenues and a worsening economic situation. This was stated by the head of the Federation Council Committee on Budget and Financial Markets, Anatoly Artamonov. And do you know how exactly this Artamonov proposes to close the budget gap? Very simply. He says, listen, yes, we just need to raise taxes for Russians and make them pay more into the budget, he says. And it doesn't matter if they earn little or what problems they have, nobody cares. We'll just raise taxes, collect tribute from the serfs, continue the war, and that's it. And this same Artamonov publicly stated that right now Russia is spending every third ruble on the war. This is a record share since the Soviet Union. But now there's nowhere left to get the money from. Well, and as the Kremlin admitted, the reserves for patching up budget holes are close to being exhausted. The liquid assets of the National Wealth Fund, which reached $120 billion before the start of the full-scale war, had decreased to $52 billion by July 1, 2025. That is almost 2.5 times. The official figure is already grim, but the real one is even more discouraging. And now the most important thing, if oil prices remain low, even the officially declared reserve of this National Wealth Fund will be depleted by the end of this year. Again, these aren't my words, but those of Russian officials. A new blow to the budget could be the tightening of European Union sanctions and the so-called floating price cap on Russian oil. It is expected that from the current $60, the price cap will drop to $47 per barrel and will be set at 15% below the average quotes for the previous 3 months. In this scenario, the budget will lose at least another 1.5 trillion rubles over the year. Well, if Donald Trump also introduces secondary tariffs against India and China, who are buying Russian oil, that will completely destroy the Russian economy. And, as is known, India has already stated that it will not take the risk and will simply completely refuse Russian oil if Trump actually imposes tariffs. I will talk about this in the next episode, and I'll give you a spoiler right away. As it turned out, it's very easy for India to do this. They really can easily give up all Russian oil and literally switch to other suppliers in just a few days. This was officially announced today in New Delhi. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this channel, you can do so financially with any donation. You can use the links and payment details in the description of this video or the QR code on your screen. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone. Subtitles created by